probably a lot of them Gen Xers now, have gone through 2 economic downturns. And so that's going to affect how they think in the long run. Going through this pandemic, we're going to see leadership wanting to make decisions, whether consciously or unconsciously, that are a direct result of this experience. Psychological studies that show that these leaders were going to be more willing to accept minimal losses today if it means avoiding larger losses in the long term, which means that they're more willing to make investments now more than ever, probably even previously, because it's going to help them be more preventative and emerge better off in the long run. I think that these investments should be considered more centered around safer measures or steps rather than far-reaching ideas. I don't think they're going to want to go too far. They're going to want to take those incremental steps that they see as tangible offerings that help them in the long run. And so going forward, I think one thing you could think about is when you're talking to the C-suite and you're thinking about these meetings, what are you offering them that can help them be more equipped for that long-term mentality? Next, from a behavioral standpoint, digital extroversion. I'm pretty sure, I would hope people would say that it's no surprise that we're all more comfortable with digital first experiences right now. Clearly, as we are all on a Zoom meeting versus an in-person meeting right now, we're all much more used to this face-to-face through technology. And I think our reliance on technology is only going to become stronger as we have now expected our companies to offer it as a standard, as a norm, versus as an exception to the rule. I think there could be opportunities for this digital extroversion through financial opportunities, which might be things like virtual events, distance working, definitely, monitoring of resources, or even just helping other people form connections. Technology, which might have be seen as divisive prior to this, is probably going to be seen as much more of a something that joins us together, causing more or better communication with person to person as we've gotten used to it. One thing that we're looking to capitalize on is how can we allow digital interaction in a space that still allows company culture and engagement with the employees. So thinking about what are the large events that you can do digitally that still allow people to feel connected with each other and don't feel like you have to wait and or pause as somebody finishes speaking. And the last behavioral topic is one that I'm really excited about, honestly. I think post-pandemic, many people will have a new understanding of what anxiety truly is. And I think the stigma of mental health can be a conversation of strength now as we respect the boundaries of others due to their mental well-being. I think despite the economic slowdown, there are actually reports that are saying that wellness, spending on wellness is actually being forecasted as actually increasing. We've all found a new way to have self-care during this traumatic time. And so I think this is going to be a key focus for all sectors, not just architecture or the built environment. I think healthcare, I think retail are all going to want to figure out what mental health and what their offerings are for helping people to shape the narrative for their new well-being lifestyle. One consideration on behaviors with clients and meetings, employees, and others is considering how you can approach them from a standpoint of being able to set them up with a much more healthy lifestyle with whatever it is that you are offering. And then a second part of this, when it comes to mental health, is that, you know, at MA, we were already piloting what we have called the Respite Room. The room that's designed using evidence-based design and behavioral psychology to help calm the central nervous system. And I think we're going to see more spaces like that that are going to be needed, not only in the workplace, but in our higher education facilities, in our homes, where we shop and where we go get our care too. The reason that we started down this path is because before the pandemic, the World Health Organization had actually cited that by 2030, depression was going to be the #1 healthcare concern. And we were already seeing a lot of issues come up from stress, especially chronic stress, and how it affects us, our bodies, you know, whether it's through weight gain or issues with our immune system or just our mental well-being. And so I think we're going to, again, want to find ways that we can provide safety, comfort, and control within the built environment. Allows people to take a break. An interesting aside to this mental health is that we're actually seeing the rise of creativity and crafting become a mainstay to actually avoid stress and act as a coping mechanism. In our studies of our respite room, we actually found that simple acts like coloring can help calm the central nervous system and move us from that fight or flight mode into a mode of readiness and building more resiliency in our life. If you want to know a little bit more about this, we actually have several blogs up about our respite room on our website, as well as we actually have a blog up about what safe spaces are and how to incorporate them from a design standpoint. And so with that, we took a look at the generations, we took a look at some behaviors, and we wanted to give you an idea of, where we got some of the ideas that we're getting ready to discuss. And a lot of it came from just simple observations through the news, through reading articles, but also looking to the past. And that's the big thing. So I am a certified futurist, which means that I look at eventualities. I look at possible pathways given what we know and kind of overlaying them and seeing what's possible from that. So while we're calling them predictions, they're really more forecasts in that these are just potential avenues that we see happening. And again, some of them already are happening. By taking a look at things like low touch curbside pickup, everybody's Netflixing right now, and there's more and more digital platforms. I think I just heard HBO has a new platform that just came out. Some more entertainment opportunities. The idea of comfort, choice and control, digital reliance, crafting, and then this idea of augmented intelligence, I think is going to be something that we're seeing a lot talked about right now. And then I think we're going to be seeing it more in the built environment as well. So with that, we came up with these predictions. And so the first one is this idea of pop-up celebrations, which I think is something that really comes from the fact that we've all experienced loss right now. We have not had experiences where we have not been able to go to a graduation or to a wedding or even to celebrate with a coworker or celebrate a birthday. And so I think this idea is that we're going to be wanting to gather in small doses, but use those gatherings to replace what we've lost with a sense of joy. And I think that we're going to see these pop-up celebrations happen in multiple venues. So maybe some of the empty venues that are sitting, some of the venues that are sitting empty right now could consider ways that they could incorporate these pop-up celebrations that could bring culture back to life. Part of our loss is a loss of connection. And so these celebrations also facilitate bringing community together. We talked about it in our office, and we asked people what the first thing they wanted to do when they got back into more of a normal, I'll use air quotes, routine. And the first thing that they said is they want to go to restaurants. And I think we'll see these idea of this pop-up celebration carrying into the restaurant as the restaurants are now trying to pivot to figure out how to practice social distancing and practice safety. I think the big thing about this idea of pop-up celebrations is that it will happen when you choose for it to, rather than being forced to experience it. Up next is the rewilding of humanity. And really this forecast comes from the concept that we talk a lot about when we think about urban development. Rewilding is really aimed at restoring natural processes. Right now we're living in the era of the Anthropocene, which is where humanity has a larger effect on nature than the natural processes do. And so this idea of rewilding really centers around what the return of our culture is going to mean and look like, and what we'll be aware of, what we will make our new normal. The attention to natural processes will force us to focus on how we can be better. We've all seen what's happened as we shelter in place, where we've seen stories about there's no smog in LA, the Himalayas are visible in India for the first time, air in China has been clear, the canals in Venice have been clear. And so I think this idea of rewilding and being more aware of our carbon footprint is going to force us to focus on how we can produce things more locally, be more organic, be more responsible with our resources. One thing that a lot of people are asking is if we think that we're going to return back to what we had before. And I think it's hard to say that we will 100% change, but I definitely think that we're going to be more on the end of coming out different than we were, than going back to something that we had before. So I think we should all be thinking about how we can rewild ourselves. Just continuing that just a little bit more, some indicators for our retail sector show that people are wanting to return to shop, but they're just afraid to. We had many states that opened up stores, and a lot of people stayed home. And I think the big signifier for that is that, again, it's about choice, comfort, and control. And so we saw things like new apps and even old apps like Open Table, which now allows you to schedule a time to go to the grocery store. And, so I think that drives from seeing the opportunity for senior citizens to go to a grocery store at a separate time to keep them more safe. What's funny about this is that malls in China were already practicing something similar. They were just doing it for different reasons. They were actually opening up earlier to allow people to go and interact with one another to form a community. And so I think we're going to see more of this where we may not be completely ready to return to society unless we can time the events and, again, choose how we want to do it. We're also redefining what touch looks like in our culture and our society. I personally believe that the handshake is gone. And so I think we're going to see new introductory methods. Right now, we're toying around with the idea that another person's voice is actually going to be the primary means of human-to-human connection in this digital era. And all along with this, we've again found new ways to manage with our daily life. As we re-enter the workspace or our learning spaces or our built environments, I think we're going to want to find ways to continue having those self-care moments throughout our day versus just trying to power through. And little by little, we will find a new normal, but it'll again be more about providing comfort and control and choice as we explore what that modality looks like. Specifically, from a reentering the workplace standpoint, and we have an entire blog about this up on our website of what we think is going to happen 3 days, 3 months, and then even 3 years after we re-enter the workplace. I think, again, it's going to be about comfort, choice, and control. We're going to be thinking about our entry sequences and what our lobbies look like. We're going to be looking at how people can be separate but still communicate with each other. And I think we're going to see a little bit about how we need to reignite culture given all of these parameters. And so that idea of pop-up celebrations could actually be really key when it comes to re-entering the workforce to keep the workforce engaged with one another. Prior to the pandemic, we were already doing studies that showed that engagement actually increases productivity. And so I think this idea of figuring out when people are comfortable for working and want to work and how that plays into keeping them engaged also will tie into productivity is going to be an interesting dynamic to navigate. So taking those kind of forecasts and predictions, here are the big 3 things that, just from my future's perspective, that I think we're going to be seeing. And that is this idea of local lists, repurposing assets, and then digitization. So local lists, if you're not familiar with, so there's a term out there called hybridic, and it really means where we take 2 words and we smash them together. And we see it a lot in our design industry when we think about design styles. And so there's the term out there called residential, which is about blending the residential world and the commercial world. And so this localvists is really about local activists. And that's where this came from. And I think it's going to be a really big trend because the demands for goods and services that are closer to home, that require little travel or commute and are immediately accessible and are safe is going to be on high demand. We in Columbus are very fortunate enough that we have very ease of access to our downtown, whereas I know people in the DC and Virginia area are much more used to taking the metro. And as we think about when we are comfortable going back to work, we are probably going to see people who may not want to get on the metro because they're a little bit more afraid of being jammed into a metal tube with other people who may not share their same values of social distancing or safety. And so I think we're going to see transportation have to go through a major renovation and change, maybe even focusing on how they can get people more to like local hubs or local communities. And I think a lot of this is due to that this idea of local really provides transparency and stability because people can have an almost open source knowledge of where products and goods and services can come from. The idea of convenience, again, goes back to what's close by is probably perceived as safer. So seeing more local areas, more local delivery hubs and food delivery platforms might be incorporating more of this idea of like pop-up spaces within the actual neighborhoods themselves, and the idea of the neighborhood becoming much more important versus the overall city at large. So these pop-up spaces for local neighborhoods could allow for food trucks to come through, that could allow for a pharmacy to come through on a different day, that could allow for a dry cleaner to come through on a different day. So your goods and services are now traveling more towards that local community area. And then again, the neighborhoods are going to be becoming much more of a focus on where personalized service can happen. Even maybe our healthcare being able to be provided much more within the community versus us going to a far away service provider. Up next is this idea of repurposing assets. And a lot of this stems from the fact that our infrastructure that we currently have was never built for a complete shutdown. We've gone from fast-paced, overstimulated to an interactive to a snail's pace and almost completely empty shelf spaces. And so I think after this, we're going to see spaces and places that are going to want to be flexible and want to be able to pivot as needed. And so that's the idea of taking our empty malls or empty dorm rooms or other vacant venue spaces and giving them a second purpose and a second life that will allow them to have off-hour use so that they will never just sit empty and idle again. I think that this idea of reinvention also comes into play when we think about our retail offerings too, and what our deliverables are. We're seeing a lot more, like we had a local brewery here who took what their normal product offering was. They weren't able to offer that, so they started manufacturing hand sanitizer. And so I think, again, this idea of like figuring out what your second purpose is and what your second offering could be is going to allow you to have much more stability in the future, so that way you can not feel like if one part of your business shuts down, then the whole part of your business shuts down. And experience is really going to be key for this, because while we are going to be much more digital first, we're going to expect still that emotional connection. And I think that's where our next topic of digitization is really going to come into play. And so lastly, this era of our, I guess, prediction of digitization. Again, we've all come to rely on Zoom technology, and just the thought of it at first was for business purposes, but is now for personal communication and connection. And again, technology is no longer a bad thing, it's no longer divisive, but limits still need to be put in place on it. Live streaming is now, I think, going to be the preferred method for a lot of people to communicate, for a lot of retail environments to sell, because it's highly social and very interactive, and you can almost do it from anywhere. Actually, we've seen China implement this a lot for some of their restaurants and even for some of their shopping areas and stores. I think pushing AR and VR is still going to help create community connection, but we also need to, again, to help create emotion. And I think that right now we're trying to see that how things like digital avatars can be the face of the company and still have a face-to-face interaction with somebody that may not be an actual person. And this idea of digitization also provides security, because it really allows us, again, that choice, comfort, and control when we interact with goods and services. We're working with a local restaurant group right now, and they are trying to pivot so that they have more meal pickup services. So more of those things like Amazon lockers and storage spaces that people can go to be able to still get the goods and services. They can just check in on the app on the phone, make their purchase on the phone, and then go do it or go pick it up. And so right now we're working with them on what that experience looks like that, again, provides a human-to-human connection. And the last part of this idea of digitization is really about augmented intelligence. And so augmented intelligence comes from augmented reality and then artificial intelligence. Prior to the pandemic, a lot of people were worried about artificial intelligence and its ramifications for losing jobs. And I think what we're exploring right now is how this idea of our devices and technology can actually help us be better, help us be better at translating the big data that's out there, and how it can help take over some of the mundane tasks of our lives that allow us more personal time and maybe a little bit more time to upskill ourselves or our career. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jana on her sustainability predictions.
Thanks, Mark. Well, okay, just checking my audio. It's no surprise that we're seeing health and wellness emerge as this top priority right now. And that's around the world, right? And this has remained a top priority for us as we're absorbing our new reality, as states are beginning to open back up, and as we start to reimagine our built environment. And as an architect, I see the built environment as a foundation for our health and well-being. However, I realized that very few of my non-architect friends did until this very crisis. They just didn't understand or didn't see the built environment having an impact on our health and well-being. And yet we interact with the built environment on a daily basis. We navigate spaces, we touch surfaces, we breathe in the air, we hang out with our friends. So there's some key areas that we anticipate strengthening as we emerge on the other side of this pandemic crisis. And those are elements like mindfulness, like air quality and cleaning, restoring nature, and also our connections with each other. Next slide, please. So it's important to remember, and as Mark alluded to this, it's important to remember to understand our new relationship with trauma, to recognize our need for emotional well-being, and to provide opportunities for respite. It's especially important for us to recognize that what we're going through is a crisis, and what we're all feeling in our very different ways is very real. And we as industry professionals, as a community, as a nation, will discover new ways to manage our stress, and we'll emerge from this more resilient. So key factors in becoming more resilient and more mindful are the ways that we find to reduce our stress, to support ourselves emotionally, and to maintain a good work-life balance, even as we work from home. To alleviate stress and anxiety, a priority will be to incorporate more moments and more areas for respite, spaces that allow us to reset and to restore ourselves, which will increase our overall happiness and our productivity. Currently, we all have this really heightened sensitivity to people, to surfaces, to just generally being outside the safety of our homes. And we need to be able to address that in the built environment so that as everyone leaves the safety of their homes, they feel safe and they feel productive as they're going back to work, even just going to the grocery store. Next slide, please. To help us feel safe, and we're already seeing a lot of this, of course, we have a new relationship with this concept of what is clean, what lacks germs. Essential factors to achieving this, of course, are hand washing and cleaning and through fresh air. Now, in the direct response to COVID-19, we've experienced the shift towards more rigorous cleaning, starting with our hands, of course. We're controlling the things that we can personally control. And we're all really good at washing our hands now. But how might we think, or how might we address that in the built environment? And so maybe instead of sinks being behind a layer of closed doors, they get pulled out into the more public realm to be more visible, to be more convenient for washing our hands on a more frequent basis, especially good during flu season, right? We've also increased the frequency and rigor of our cleaning protocols, especially high-touch surfaces like door handles, like light switches, even our phones. And this will likely spark a renewed interest in no-touch or sensor technologies, like automatic faucets at the sink. Maybe a completely no-touch restroom. Clean environments also make us think about air quality, and especially air purification. And recent studies have shown that COVID spreads mostly through aerosol transmission, sparking us to get calls from our clients like, what do I do to clean the air? So we're already seeing a desire for increased ventilation and operable windows to get more fresh air. If those aren't possible for you, a lot of people can't really just increase the ventilation in their HVAC. They don't have operable windows. Some of the answers could be newer technologies like bipolar ionization. And that's an air purification technology where charged ions actually bind with contaminants in the air. So they're effectively neutralized. It neutralizes VOCs, it reduces allergens. In the cases of bacteria and viruses, it actually damages the cell structure. And recent studies of similar viruses show an upwards of 90% reduction in as little as 30 minutes. So it seems pretty promising. Now, for those of you considering antimicrobial finishes as part of the clean surfaces solution, I encourage you to weigh the long-term health effects and the environmental impacts of the chemicals that compose antimicrobial finishes. These are known hazardous chemicals, and currently there are no studies to prove their efficacy as antimicrobial. Next slide, please. Restoring nature. So key takeaways here are a new interest in biophilic design, the importance of outdoor recreation and the potential for more bikeways, and also a renewed dependence on local farms and community-supported agriculture. For some of you who may not be familiar with biophilic design, biophilia is our innate connection to nature. It's how we feel in nature. Nature is able to evoke this emotional response within us. And through biophilic design, we can bring those same feelings into the built environment through things like proportions of space, through light and shadow, through a sense of mystery and intrigue. It's literally a dopamine effect through design, which is kind of cool. And we're realizing that our connections with nature are more important than ever. And I'm actually pretty lucky because my sort of at-home office space is a separate room, and I kind of usually keep the windows open. Even though it's been really hot the past couple of days, I keep the windows open. But that means that I can hear the birds outside chirping away. I have my pets nearby. Honestly, the highlight of Zoom meetings for me is actually seeing my coworkers' cats go past the camera. Just being able to step outside for a moment of fresh air and sun. These are things that I don't often get in my typical office environment. Not that it's not amazing, it's just not easily accessible to step outside, and I can't often open a window. So these moments actually give us a moment to reflect and to refocus and to recharge. And never before has nature been so critical to our emotional well-being and to just being generally connected with our communities. Being outside also feels sort of freeing in this otherwise restricted world that we're in. I see more people out walking and biking and running. Our public parks have become places of hope and connection, inspiring us to not only protect our green spaces, but also increase those opportunities for our outdoor recreational. This may spark more interest in expanding our parks and recreational areas. Pocket parks, for instance. And you've probably seen some cities now close what are kind of empty roadways for bike use only. This allows more of us to safely bike around, to move our bodies, and to feel connected to our communities in ways that we don't normally when we're driving a car at different speeds and different scales. Maybe this will encourage more biking and support the infrastructure necessary for safer pedestrian travel in general. I mean, everyone's looking for that walkable neighborhood with shops and restaurants, and our current crisis may just be that catalyst we needed to increase that pedestrian infrastructure. Seeing empty shelves in grocery stores has demonstrated the value of local food production through small, locally owned farms and community-supported agriculture. In fact, I just read something this morning about on-demand delivery for local farms. It's kind of like a Grubhub for farm fresh produce. Local nurseries and seed suppliers have also noticed an increase in sales for home gardens. There's been a flurry of planting and yard work going on in my neighborhood. The plant stores have been hopping, and like you can't even get a parking place near them. And people are just investing in local and in resilience and being self-sufficient. Next slide, please. So as our mindsets shift to slow down and to appreciate the things we value most, people will embrace a back to basics approach. connecting with family, supporting our local communities. That shift towards slow movement is actually allowing the earth to heal. It's allowing CO2 emissions to drop. And for us to find those things that we value most, whether that be in nature or with other people, even in a virtual realm, and we have an opportunity here to build on those elements that we value most and to be able to emerge on the other side of this crisis better and more resilient. Connecting with our families, our friends, our communities has become critical for the emotional support and even just that human connection we all need. And this is sparking new and creative ways to communicate. My mom, who lives in South Carolina, is getting pretty good at Zoom and online games. And I really hope that this means we can stay more connected after we emerge, because we've developed these new tools and these new skills for some genuine hang time, even though we live in different states. This crisis is also revealing the current disparities in our local communities and how we've come together to help one another, not just on a community level, but really on a national scale. And that community aid and that support are really key factors in community and sustaining a prosperous future. Next slide, please.
All right, thank you, Jonna. So with that, real quick, I'm going to go through a couple just actionable items, and then we'll have some time for questions. So we thought we'd kind of focus this more on the and then just retail and business offerings to start off with. So the first thing, and again, we have an entire blog on this, so I don't want to get in this, but from a workplace standpoint, we're definitely going to see a lot of changes, I think, with more digital first interactions. So our meeting spaces are probably going to change, where a lot of meetings are probably going to eventually be 50% in person and then 50% still virtual. So needing to figure out that dynamic, and that's where that augmented intelligence and technology can help us, allowing for more agile teams. So prior to the pandemic, we were already looking at how choice-based work environments actually increase productivity by, I think, 17% is the statistic. And so I think allowing people to choose how and where they work is going to be something that companies are going to want to work through, while also still providing cleanliness and safety. The culture care packages is something that we see that it can allow for kind of a sea of sameness around that. A lot of employees may not have had the same setups that others did. So I know that I've got a standing desk, but I know some of my coworkers don't. So there may be packages that allow for each employee, when they're working from home, to have that same opportunities that they would in the work environment. And then again, this is just this idea of flexible asset use and what can happen on the weekends in the workplace that could still allow the community to be able to come in and connect with them and maybe even use their space so that it doesn't sit empty. So just thinking about things in the short term, definitely thinking about a commute plan for employees and for workers, thinking about how the entry would look like for the employee and even for guests in your lobby spaces and maybe even the building or the homes that they are living in. I think for multifamily residential projects, we're having discussions really specifically around what the doorway looks like and what that experience is going to be. Creating that socially distanced plan to allow for people to have an understanding of where they can work and what's safe around them. Allowing for agility for choosing when to work even. I think one thing that I didn't touch on was that we're talking about the 24-hour work cycle and how with now technology, we're able to work from home because it works. And so some of our employees may not need to come back to the office, but they may need to work at a different time because of their caregiver may not be able to provide them care during the time that they usually are able to. Again, focusing on company culture and engagement, and then addressing fears and concerns with transparency and stability as employees re-engage is going to be critical so that they feel, again, that comfort that they are going to be safe. Long-term, plan for retrofits. I think we're going to see a lot of changes architecturally and in the built environment. Implementing touchless procedures. So Jonna alluded to the touchless restroom, which is something that, again, we have been studying. We've actually got a blog up on that too. We've been doing a lot of thought leadership during this time to try to stay ahead of things, which is one of the great things that we like about MA. And then this idea of creating workplace hubs plays up the localist idea where some of the big corporations, like we have Nationwide Insurance that's located in Columbus, Ohio, and they're figuring out how a majority of their workers can now just work from home. And so what does that mean from a real estate standpoint from them? And where does that real estate get relocated to? And it might be more in the local community so that people can still engage with each other, but not necessarily do it in a specific office. And then just thinking about from a retail and business standpoint, becoming more local so that some of your sourcing channels might not be interrupted as they were during this time. If they were things that you did that were coming from overseas, which also, and then more local could also mean just connecting with the community where they are in their neighborhoods. Low touch, but high engagement. So again, digital first platforms that allow for connection, but are still engaging and still about the experience. And then allowing you to figure out what your second asset pivot is going to be so that your second offering can help facilitate those new partnerships and products that allow you to create new goods and services that in times of future pandemics or shutdowns or just times of crisis allow you to pivot to have a second offering. So in the short term, thinking about limited in-store experiences, developing delivery offerings, finding new local sources and locations to engage, like the pocket parks that Jana spoke of that could be just right around the corner in a neighborhood. And then really defining what your values and what's important to you and communicating that to your consumers. In the long term, again, redeveloping the physical space that may allow for more virtual interaction, maybe more augmented intelligence interaction. And then offering secondary products to change from waste to reuse. Developing local pop-up locations to engage with the community where they are. And so with that, we come to the end of our presentation. Again, my name is Mark Bryan and Jonna Keller. We thank you for your time and hopefully you found something interesting. And we've got about 7 minutes left. So Angela, if there's anybody that wants to take over the chat, please feel free to let us know.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Let's see here. I'm looking, I feel like Ed Messick may have just, on new remodeling designs, what trends are you seeing with new clients after the challenges began? So Ed, is that intended for our presenters or for our members who are on the call?
It could be either, but I mean, they're an architecture firm working in Ohio and looks like working probably with people from around the country, if I had to guess, to the size of their organization. Right. So I guess, with, from your presentation and everything that you've said here today, what are your residential clients asking for that may be different from mid-March and in the past?
Well, I think it depends if you're thinking about residential in terms of single family homes or in terms of multifamily homes.
Do you guys do any work with any like major remodeling or anything like that?
I mean, we do. Yeah. So I think it just depends on, excuse me. So in our multifamily, when we're thinking about it, because we go in and retrofit projects all the time, I think the amenity spaces are going to change. So shared amenity spaces may not be as thought of as something that's desirable. And then I think, in terms of like the single family homes, I think it's just, again, more about what that entry experience is going to be like for people who are, wanting to provide a safe entry space. A lot of times people were coming into homes that were directly funneled into the kitchen. And so I think we're going to see a step in between that, where we want to try to think about like how we may be able to expand from our doorway to through a safe space into a communal space. And even that communal space may be even wider. So those open floor plans may still be a continued trend that allow people to practice social distancing when they want to. One thing that we're also talking about with our residential projects is seeing if we can incorporate balconies. Especially for our high-rise projects or mid-rise projects, we are wanting to be able to provide people access to nature and outside when they don't have to necessarily go all the way through a common corridor or even just to a common shared amenity space.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for Mark and Jonna while we have them on the phone? Mark, in your presentation, you mentioned Kevin Mullinex' blog. What does Kevin do, and what would we find in that blog? Is that more of the safety, comfort, and control rewilding?
Yeah, so that's more about psychological safety. So he just has a background and in some of his studies and his thesis about what how the built environment can affect the sense of safety. And
Right.
so I think that's really important, especially as we want to understand like what people need and how they want to fulfill that need. And then we have a separate one, which is about the respite space, which is more about how we can actually calm the central nervous system down.
Okay, thank you. We've had a lot of discussions, I guess, among our members about just different residential changes, design changes that they are going to see. You know, home offices. I think we all realize that our home office is not as great as we'd like it to be. I think it's interesting the thought of companies taking a look at their current workspaces and allowing people, you know, the productivity of working from home and the increase in that, I think, has been really, really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else who has any questions? I'm going to put my email in the chat. If anybody didn't get a chance to send Debbie their email, but they want to email me to get a copy of the presentation and recording, please let me know. I am putting that in the chat now. Last chance for any questions. All right. Well, I really appreciate it. It's very interesting. You guys have adapted it a little since I saw it last, so I appreciate that.
Yep.
And, I'll definitely be in touch with you, Mark, after